Captain Fisher, in his official capacity, wore a saber, but he never picked up a gun again, even to face an armed man. There was the November evening when Stambaugh showed up on the road outside the Fisher house. He was a quick-moving, broad-shouldered neighbor, and there was bad blood between him and Milt Fisher, one of Jake's sons. It was supper time, and Jake had just finished saying grace. One of his darkies came running into the dining room. "Stambaugh's come to get Mr. Milt," he said. "He got a shotgun in one hand and a broadaxe in t'other." Jake told Milt and his other sons to sit still. He took his napkin out of his collar and went out the door empty-handed. "Jake took Stambaugh's gun away from him and broke it in two," said Uncle Malin. "Then he snapped the axe handle and throwed the pieces away. He broke that gun and axe in his hands like you'd break a stick." When Fort Sumter was fired on, Jake Fisher, still hard as a boulder, had just turned 53. They wouldn't take him in the Army, so he stayed at home and fought copperheads and mealy-mouthed patriots with his fists. On a market day, Jake would lick as many as 6-8 men, Uncle Malin said, mostly men who questioned Lincoln's policies or turned scared after a rebel victory. Once a fella that was riding on a horse yelled something that angered your great-grandpa, and Jake ordered him down off his horse. The fella was just taking off his coat to square away when Jake walked over to the horse. "We gotta have more room," he said. "I don't want you to hit this horse when I throw you." Thereupon he picked the animal up in his arms and moved it 8 or 10 feet away. He was used to doing that in his own blacksmith shop. It was easier to move 'em that way than to lead 'em sometimes. Well, when the fella saw that, he took to his heels and ran faster than an Indian. On another occasion during the war years, a friend of Jake's told him that 5 men, probably copperheads, were conspiring to beat Jake up. They were in the back room of Frick's saloon, laying plans for a mass assault. Jake jumped on a horse and rode over to the place. "He didn't knock them fellas down," said Uncle Malin. "He throwed 'em. Jake only fought with his fists over political or religious questions. He throwed fellas that whipped up ducks or were just plain ornery." It was also during the Civil War, when Morgan's raiders had crossed over into Ohio, that a train of boxcars on its way to Cincinnati stopped in the yards in Columbus. Jake found out that they were crowded with men, home guards, on their way to protect the Ohio-Kentucky border. "The goddamn copperheads has cooped them boys up in there without no air," said Jake. He tore a rail loose from a siding, and swinging it like a tennis racket, beat holes in the sides of each car. The authorities always looked the other way when Jake started out on one of his rampages. Nobody wanted to arrest a man as good as Jake, Uncle Malin said. In his 70s, Jake Fisher could still lift 200 pounds dead weight from the ground and hold it at arm's length above his head. 3 years before he died, he performed his last exploit in public. The drunken driver of a team of horses on High Street tumbled over onto the doubletrees, and the horses took off. Jake outran the other men who saw it happen and pulled the team to a stop. "I can still catch 'em," he said proudly, "and if I can catch 'em, I can hold 'em." In his last days, he had little respect for the soft race of men he saw growing up around him. When he was taken to see a newborn great-grandchild, a puny boy weighing 7 pounds, Jake snorted. "God damn it," he said, "the next generation of Fishers is going to be squirrels." In his 77th year, Jake took to his bed for the last time. As he lay dying, the preacher called on him. "Don't you want to forgive your enemies?" he asked. Jake smiled. "I ain't got none," he said. "I licked 'em all." The Letters of James Thurber. Adams was a great letter writer of the type that is now almost extinct. His circle of friends was larger, perhaps, and more distinguished than that of any other American of his generation. H.S. Commager on Letters of Henry Adams. James Thurber was a letter writer of the type that is now completely extinct. His circle of correspondence was perhaps no larger, but it was easily more bewildered than that of any other American of his generation. Thurber laid the foundation for his voluminous correspondence during his formative period. In those years he wrote to many distinguished persons, none of whom ever replied, among them Admiral Schley, young Barbarian, Senator Atlee Pomerine, June Caprice, and a man named Unglaub, who played first base for the Washington Senators at the turn of the century. Unglaub, in Thurber's estimation, stood head and shoulders above all the rest of his correspondence, and indeed he said so in his letter to McKinley. Thurber did not write as many letters as Henry Adams or John J. Chapman or some of the other boys whose correspondence has been published lately, but that is because he never set pen to paper after his 43rd year. The effect of Thurber's letters on his generation was about the same as the effect of anybody's letters on any generation, that is to say, nil. It is only when a man's letters are published after his death that they have any effect, and this effect is usually only on literary critics. Nobody else ever reads a volume of letters, and anybody who says he does is a liar. A person may pick up a volume of correspondence now and then and read a letter here and there, but he never gets any connected idea of what the man is trying to say, and soon abandons the book for the poems of John Greenleaf Whittier. This is largely because every man whose letters have ever been published was in the habit of writing every third one to a Mrs. Cameron, or a Mrs. Winslow, or a Miss Betch, the confidant of a lifetime, with whom he shared any number of gaily obscure little secrets. These letters all read like this: Dear Puttums, I love what you say about Mooey. It's so devastatingly true. B dropped in yesterday, Icky was out at the time, and gave some sort of report on Neddy, but I am afraid I didn't listen. Ut ediendam aut debendo. He and Liddy are in Venice, I think I gathered, or Newport. What in the world do you suppose came over Buppa that great night? You, of course, were as splendidly consequent as ever, in loco sporente abadaba est. But I was deeply disappointed in Sig's reaction. All he can think of, poor fellow, is Marjorie's flight. Remind me to tell you someday what Pet said about the ordeal. These particular letters are sometimes further obscured by a series of explanatory editorial footnotes, such as probably Harry Boynton or his brother Norton, a neighbor at Bar Harbor, the late Edward J. Belcher, also sometimes lovingly referred to as Butty, a niece-in-law by his first marriage. In the end, as I say, one lays the book aside for Snowbound in order to get a feeling of reality before going to bed. Thurber's letters from Europe during his long stay there in 1937 and 1938, the European phase, are perhaps the least interesting of all those he or anybody else ever wrote. He seems to have had at no time any idea at all, either clear or vague, as to what was going on. A certain groping, to be sure, is discernible, but it doesn't appear to be toward anything. All this may have been due in great part to the fact that he took his automobile to Europe with him and spent most of his time worrying about running out of gas. The gasoline gauge of his car had got out of order, and sometimes registered empty when the tank was half full, and full when it contained only 2 or 3 gallons. A stronger character would have had the gauge fixed, or carried a 5-gallon can of essence in the back of the car, thus releasing the mind for more mature and significant preoccupations, but not Thurber. I have been unable to find any one of Thurber's many correspondents who saved any of his letters. Thurber himself kept carbons, although this is not generally known or cared about. We threw them out when we moved, people would tell me, or we gave them to the janitor's little boy. Thurber gradually became aware of this on his return to America, the final phase, because of the embarrassed silence that always greeted him when at his friends' homes he would say, "Why don't we get out my letters to you and read them aloud?" After a painful pause, the subject was quickly changed, usually by putting up the ping-pong table. In his last years, the once voluminous letter-writer ceased writing letters altogether, and such communication as he maintained with the great figures of his time was over the telephone, and consisted of getting prominent persons on the phone, making a deplorable sound with his lips, and hanging up. His continual but vain attempts to reach the former Barbara Hutton by telephone clouded the last years of his life, but at the same time gave him something to do. His last words to his wife at the fag end of the final phase were, "Before they put up the ping-pong table, tell them I am not running out of gas." He was as wrong and as mixed up in this particular instance as he was in most others. I am not sure that we should not judge him too harshly. A friend to Alexander. "I have taken to dreaming about Aaron Burr every night," Andrews said. "What for?" said Mrs. Andrews. "How do I know what for?" Andrews snarled. "What for?" the woman says. Mrs. Andrews did not flare up. She simply looked at her husband as he lay on the chaise longue in her bedroom, in his heavy blue dressing gown, smoking a cigarette. Although he had just got out of bed, he looked haggard and tired. He kept biting his lower lip between puffs. "Aaron Burr is a funny person to be dreaming about nowadays. I mean, with all the countries in the world at war with each other. I wish you would go and see Dr. Fox," said Mrs. Andrews, taking her thumb from between the pages of her mystery novel and tossing the book toward the foot of the bed. She sat up straighter against her pillow. "Maybe Haliver oil or B1 is what you need," she said. "B1 does wonders for people. I don't see why you see him in your dreams. Where do you see him?" "Oh, places, in Washington Square or Bowling Green or on Broadway. I'll be talking to a woman in a Victoria, a woman holding a white lace parasol, and suddenly there will be Burr, bowing and smiling and smelling like a carnation, telling his stories about France and getting off his insults." Mrs. Andrews lighted a cigarette, although she rarely smoked until after lunch. "Who is the woman in the Victoria?" she asked. "What? How do I know? You know about people in dreams, don't you? They are nobody at all or everybody." "You see Aaron Burr plainly enough, though. I mean, he isn't nobody or everybody." All right, said Andrews. "You have me there, but I don't know who the woman is, and I don't care. Maybe it's Madame Jumel or Mittens Willett or a girl I knew in high school. That's not important." "Who is Mittens Willett?" asked Mrs. Andrews. "She was a famous New York actress in her day, 50 years ago or so. She's buried in an old cemetery on 2nd Avenue. "That's very sad," said Mrs. Andrews. "Why is it?" demanded Andrews, who was now pacing up and down the deep red carpet. "I mean, she probably died young," said Mrs. Andrews. "Almost all women did in those days." Andrews ignored her and walked over to a window and looked out at a neat, bleak street in the 50s. "He's a vile, cynical cad," said Andrews, suddenly turning away from the window. "I was standing there talking to Alexander Hamilton when Burr stepped up and slapped him in the face. When I looked at Hamilton, who do you suppose he was?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Andrews. "Who was he?" "He was my brother, the one I've told you about, the one who was killed by that drunkard in the cemetery." Mrs. Andrews had never got that story straight, and she didn't want to go into it again now. The facts in the tragic case and her way of getting them mixed up always drove Andrews into a white-faced fury. "I don't think we ought to dwell on your nightmare," said Mrs. Andrews. "I think we ought to get out more. We could go to the country for weekends." Andrews wasn't listening. He was back at the window, staring out into the street again. "I wish he'd go back to France and stay there," Andrews snapped out suddenly the next morning at breakfast. "Who, dear?" said his wife. "Oh, you mean Aaron Burr? Did you dream about him again? I don't see why you dream about him all the time. Don't you think you ought to take some luminol?" "No," said Andrews. "I don't know. Last night he kept shoving Alexander around." "Alexander?" "Hamilton. God knows I'm familiar enough with him to call him by his first name. He hides behind my coattails every night, or tries to." "I was thinking we might go to the old Drover's Inn this weekend," said Mrs. Andrews. "You like it there." "Hamilton has become not only my brother Walter, but practically every other guy I have ever liked," said Andrews. "That's natural." "Of course it is," she said. They got up from the table. "I do wish you'd go to Dr. Fox." "I'm going to the zoo," he said, "and feed popcorn to the rhinoceros. That makes things seem right, for a little while, anyway." It was 2 nights later at 5 o'clock in the morning that Andrews bumbled into his wife's bedroom in pajamas and bare feet, his hair in his eyes wild. "He got him," he croaked. "He got him! The bastard got him! Alexander fired into the air. He fired in the air and smiled at him, just like Walter. And that fiend from hell took deliberate aim. I saw him take deliberate aim. He killed him in cold blood, the foul scum." Mrs. Andrews, not quite awake, was fumbling in the box containing the Nembutol, while her husband ranted on. She made him take 2 of the little capsules between his sobs. Andrews didn't want to go see Dr. Fox, but he went to humor his wife. Dr. Fox leaned back in his swivel chair behind his desk and looked at Andrews. "Now, just what seems to be the trouble?" he asked. "Nothing seems to be the trouble," said Andrews. The doctor looked at Mrs. Andrews. "He has nightmares," she said. "You look a little underweight, perhaps," said the doctor. "Are you eating well, getting enough exercise?" "I'm not underweight," said Andrews. "I eat the way I always have and get the same exercise." At this, Mrs. Andrews sat straighter in her chair and began to talk, while her husband lighted a cigarette. "You see, I think he's worried about something," she said, "because he always has this same dream. It's about his brother Walter, who was killed in a cemetery by a drunken man, only it isn't really about him." The doctor did the best he could with this information. He cleared his throat, tapped on the glass top of his desk with the fingers of his right hand, and said, "Very few people are actually killed in cemeteries." Andrews stared at the doctor coldly and said nothing. "I wonder if you would mind stepping into the next room," the doctor said to him. "Well, I hope you're satisfied," Andrews snapped at his wife as they left the doctor's office a half hour later. "You heard what he said. There's nothing the matter with me at all." "I'm glad your heart is so fine," she told him. "He said it was fine, you know." "Sure," said Andrews. "It's fine, everything's fine." They got into a cab and drove home in silence. "I was just thinking," said Mrs. Andrews as the cab stopped in front of their apartment building, "I was just thinking that now that Alexander Hamilton is dead, you won't see anything more of Aaron Burr." The cab driver, who was handing Andrews change for a dollar bill, dropped a quarter on the floor. Mrs. Andrews was wrong. Aaron Burr did not depart from her husband's dreams. Andrews said nothing about it for several mornings, but she could tell. He brooded over his breakfast, did not answer any of her questions, and jumped in his chair if she dropped a knife or spoon. "Are you still dreaming about that man?" she asked him finally. "I wish I hadn't told you about it," he said. "Forget it, will you?" "I can't forget it with you going on this way," she said. "I think you ought to see a psychiatrist. What does he do now?" "What does who do now?" Andrews asked. "Aaron Burr," she said. "I don't see why he keeps coming into your dreams now." Andrews finished his coffee and stood up. "He goes around bragging that he did it with his eyes closed," he snarled. "He says he didn't even look. He claims he can hit the ace of spades at 30 paces blindfolded. Furthermore, since you asked what he does, he jostles me at parties now." Mrs. Andrews stood up too and put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "I think you should stay out of this, Harry," she said. "It wasn't any business of yours anyway, and it happened so long ago." "I'm not getting into anything," said Andrews, his voice rising to a shout. "It's getting into me. Can't you see that?" "I see that I've got to get you away from here," she said. "Maybe if you slept someplace else for a few nights, you wouldn't dream about him any more. Let's go to the country tomorrow. Let's go to the Lime Rock Lodge." Andrews stood for a long while without answering her. "Why can't we go and visit the Crowleys?" he said finally. "They live in the country. Bob has a pistol, and we could do a little target shooting." "What do you want to shoot a pistol for?" she asked quickly. "I think you'd want to get away from that." "Yeah," he said, "sure." And there was a far-off look in his eyes. "Sure." When they drove into the driveway of the Crowleys' house, several miles north of New Milford, late the next afternoon, Andrews was whistling Bye Bye Blackbird. Mrs. Andrews sighed contentedly, and then, as her husband stopped the car, she began looking around wildly. "My bag!" she cried. "Did I forget to bring my bag?" He laughed his old normal laugh for the first time in many days as he found the bag and handed it to her, and then for the first time in many days he leaned over and kissed her. The Crowleys came out of the house and engulfed their guests in questions and exclamations. "How you been?" said Bob Crowley to Andrews, heartily putting an arm around his shoulder. "Never better," said Andrews. "Never better. Boy, is it good to be here." They were swept into the house to a shakerful of Bob Crowley's icy martinis. Mrs. Andrews stole a happy glance over the edge of her glass at her husband's relaxed face. When Mrs. Andrews awoke the next morning, her husband lay rigidly on his back in the bed next to hers, staring at the ceiling. "Oh, God," said Mrs. Andrews. Andrews didn't move his head. "One Henry Andrews, an architect," he said suddenly in a mocking tone. "One Henry Andrews, an architect." "What's the matter, Harry?" she asked. "Why don't you go back to sleep? It's only 8 o'clock. "That's what he calls me," shouted Andrews. "One Henry Andrews, an architect," he keeps saying in his nasty little sneering voice. "One Henry Andrews, an architect." "Please don't yell," said Mrs. Andrews. "You'll wake the whole house. It's early. People want to sleep." Andrews lowered his voice a little. "I'm beneath him," he snarled. "I'm just anybody. I'm a man in a gray suit. 'Be on your good behavior, my good man,' he says to me, 'or I shall have one of my lackeys give you a taste of the riding crop.'" Mrs. Andrews sat up in bed. "Why should he say that to you?" she asked. "He wasn't such a great man, was he? I mean, didn't he try to sell Louisiana to the French or something behind Washington's back?" "He was a scoundrel," said Andrews, "but a very brilliant mind." Mrs. Andrews lay down again. "I was in hopes you weren't going to dream about him any more," she said. "I thought if I brought you up here—" "It's him or me," said Andrews grimly. "I can't stand this forever." "Neither can I," Mrs. Andrews said, and there was a hint of tears in her voice. Andrews and his host spent most of the afternoon, as Mrs. Andrews had expected, shooting at targets on the edge of the wood behind the Crowley studio. After the first few rounds, Andrews surprised Crowley by standing with his back to the huge hulk of dead tree trunk on which the targets were nailed, walking 30 paces ahead in a stiff-legged, stern-faced manner, with his revolver held at arm's length above his head, then turning suddenly and firing. Crowley dropped to the ground, uninjured but scared. "What the hell's the big idea, Harry?" he yelled. Andrews didn't say anything, but started to walk back to the tree again. Once more he stood with his back to the target and began stepping off the 30 paces. "I think they kept their arm hanging straight down," Bob called to him. "I don't think they stuck it up in the air." Andrews, still counting to himself, lowered his arm, and this time, as he turned at the 30th step, he whirled and fired from his hip 3 times in rapid succession. "Hey!" said Crowley. 2 of the shots missed the tree, but the last one hit it about 2 feet under the target. Crowley looked at his house guest oddly as Andrews began to walk back to the tree again without a word, his lips tight, his eyes bright, his breath coming fast. "What the hell?" Crowley said to himself. "Look, it's my turn," he called. But Andrews turned, then stalked ahead, unheeding. This time, when he wheeled and fired, his eyes were closed. "Good God Almighty, man," said Crowley from the grass where he lay flat on his stomach. "Hey, give me that gun, will you?" he demanded, getting to his feet. Andrews let him take it. "I need a lot more practice, I guess," he said. "Not with me standing around," said Crowley. "Come on, let's go back to the house and shake up a drink. I've got the jumps." "I need a lot more practice," said Andrews again. He got his practice next morning, just as the sun came up and the light was hard and the air was cold. He had crawled softly out of bed, dressed silently, and crept out of the room. He knew where Crowley kept the target pistol and the cartridges. There would be a target on the tree trunk, just as high as a man's heart. Mrs. Andrews heard the shots first, and sat sharply upright in bed, crying, "Harry!" almost before she was awake. Then she heard more shots. She got up, put on a dressing gown, and went to the Crowleys' door. She heard them moving about in their room. Alice opened the door and stepped out into the hall when Mrs. Andrews knocked. "Is Harry all right?" asked Mrs. Andrews. "Where is he? What is he doing?" "He's out shooting behind the studio, Bob says," Alice told her. "Bob'll go out and get him. Maybe he had a nightmare or walked in his sleep." "No," said Mrs. Andrews. "He never walks in his sleep. He's awake." "Let's go down and put on some coffee," said Alice. "He'll need some." Crowley came out of the bedroom and joined the women in the hallway. "I'll need some, too," he said. "Good morning, Bess. I'll bring him back. What the hell's the matter with him, anyway?" He was down the stairs and gone before she could answer. She was glad of that. "Come on," said Alice, taking her arm. They went down to the kitchen. Mrs. Crowley found the butler in the kitchen, just standing there. "It's all right, Madison," she said. "You go back to bed. Tell Clothita it's all right. Mr. Andrews is just shooting a little. He couldn't sleep." "Yes, ma'am," mumbled Madison, and went back to tell his wife that they said it was all right. "It can't be right," said Clothita. "Shooting pistols at this time of night?" "Hush up," Madison told her. He was shivering as he climbed back into bed. "I wish that man would go away from here," grumbled Clothita. "He's got a bad look to his eyes." Andrews brightened Clothita's life by going away late that afternoon. When he and his wife got in their chair and drove off, the Crowleys slumped into chairs and looked at each other and said, "Well." Crowley got up finally to mix a drink. "What do you think is the matter with Harry?" he asked. "I don't know," said his wife. "It's what Clothita would call the shoots, I suppose." "He said a funny thing when I went out and got him this morning," Crowley told her. "I could stand a funny thing," she said. "I asked him what the hell he was doing there in that freezing air with only his pants and shirt and shoes on. 'I'll get him one of these nights,' he said." "Why don't you sleep in my room tonight?" Mrs. Andrews asked her husband as he finished his scotch-and-water nightcap. "You'd keep shaking me all night to keep me awake," he said. "You're afraid to let me meet him. Why do you always think everybody else is better than I am? I can outshoot him the best day he ever lived. Furthermore, I have a modern pistol. He has to use an old-fashioned single-shot muzzle-loader." Andrews laughed nastily. "Is that quite fair?" his wife asked after a moment of thoughtful silence. He jumped up from his chair. "What do I care if it's fair or not?" he snarled. She got up too. "Don't be mad with me, Harry," she said. There were tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, darling," he said, taking her in his arms. "I'm very unhappy," she sobbed. "I'm sorry, darling," he said again. "Don't you worry about me. I'll be all right. I'll be fine." She was crying too wildly to say anything more. When she kissed him good night later on, she knew it was really goodbye. Women have a way of telling when you aren't coming back. "Extraordinary," said Dr. Fox the next morning, letting Andrew's dead left hand fall back upon the bed. "His heart was as sound as a dollar when I examined him the other day. It has just stopped as if he had been shot." Mrs. Andrews, through her tears, was looking at her dead husband's right hand. The 3 fingers next to the index finger were closed in stiffly on the palm, as if gripping the handle of a pistol. The taut thumb was doing its part to hold that invisible handle tightly and unwaveringly. But it was the index finger that Mrs. Andrews' eyes stayed on longest. It was only slightly curved inward, as if it were just about to press the trigger of the pistol. "Harry never even fired a shot," wailed Mrs. Andrews. "Aaron Burr killed him the way he killed Hamilton. Aaron Burr shot him through the heart. I knew he would. I knew he would." Dr. Fox put an arm about the hysterical woman and led her from the room. "She is crazy," he said to himself. "Stark, raving crazy." The Vengeance of 390-2090. I believe it was the late Hart Crane who once said at a meeting of literary persons, "We are all trapped." A few of the more neurotic lady authors made for the door under the impression that the place was on fire, but most of the male writers stood their ground and nodded their heads in rueful agreement. They comprehended what he meant. We are trapped in consciousness, trapped by mortality, trapped inside an inadequate animal body, trapped within the poor limitations of the human spirit. Some of us, this is what I have been leading up to, also happen to be caught in smaller prisons within the larger ones, like a mouse in a trap in Sing Sing. This type of badgered human being is given to the short, nervous essay rather than to the 972-page novel or autobiography. He is more likely to fret about the discomforts of his particular cell than to concern himself with prison problems as a whole. You will find him in bed groaning when other people are up lecturing. This frailty, this preoccupation with and affinity for the smaller enormities of life, permits him to be overwhelmed by minor tyrannies and persecutions to the extent that for days on end he forgets his part in the struggle for that larger freedom which now engages the attention of all right-minded prisoners of the world. I happen to be intensely dedicated to opposing the perilous wrongs and injustices of this bad earth, but right at the moment all I can worry about is my troubles as number 3902090. The sovereign state of Connecticut long ago laid a pretty trap for me. For years, like a fox, I avoided it, but this year it clamped down on me one lovely afternoon in Lakeville. In Connecticut, I am motor vehicle operator number 3902090. Whenever Connecticut thinks of me, she thinks of me as that. Our relations, until recently, have been friendly but statistical. I don't suppose now that I shall go back to her, although we may have lunch together once in a while in one of those lovely old inns. I'll say this for her, she has lovely old inns. But to get back to the trouble that came between us. Each year, before midnight on the last day of February, I must send in my application for renewal of my passenger vehicle registration. I can say in all honesty that I have never kept her waiting. She has always got my $7 long before it was due. Every time that I sent it in, however, it was my natural tendency and great desire to enclose in the same envelope my application for renewal of my driver's license, together with the $3 demanded for that. But no, I am not allowed to. I am not allowed to send that in before March 20th, as arbitrary and unmemorable a date as August 17th or February 11th. I do not know how Connecticut excuses this fiscal dowdiness. All I know is that I look upon it as a trap. I have built up a rude mental picture of a fat gentleman with thinning hair and octagonal glasses, whom no motorist has ever heard of or ever seen, a Goebbels of red tape, a Goering for discipline. He sits up in Hartford, and at the beginning of every year says to his secretary, "We will trap old 3902090 this time, my girl." He'll get his plates and his passenger registration, and then he'll go through our compulsory semi-annual inspection of his vehicle and get several more pieces of paper, one to paste on his windshield, and by the time March 20th comes around, he'll think he has all the documents necessary to drive a car. He'll forget to send in that little yellow slip for renewal of his driver's license. After all, it's only 4 1/4 by 2 1/2 inches in size, and 3902090 has been known to mislay a card table. Once he sent in his application for driver's license too early, and we shot it right back at him. Thought we had him that year, thought he'd forget to send it in again, kind of subconsciously thinking he'd already done it, see? But he fooled us. He'll forget it this time, though. Got a lot of worries, I hear, and he won't see the warnings in the newspapers because his eyes have gone back on him, and he can't read anything except children's books with large colored type. Oh, we'll get him, my girl. I've always wanted to slap one on old 3902090. He thinks he's so smart. Hasn't been caught in 10 years, but we'll get him. They got me. There isn't any use going into the argument with the state policeman who sprang the trap on me. You know it by heart. He was, my wife said, a very handsome fellow. All I know is that he was big and inflexible and wore a pretty uniform. I am against state policemen wearing uniforms, especially good-looking state policemen wearing good-looking uniforms. It gives them a sense of well-groomed power. It brings that jaunty I-could-jail-you-for-life-for-this-buddy tone into their voice. I want to see them all in 3-button sack suits with soiled gray felt hats. A man with so much authority should start out after his prey under the handicap of looking a little funny, a little unimportant. It would lend him the great and rare blessing of humility. If I could think of even one plainclothesman who was humble, I would feel more confident about this. All these ideas, of course, I thought up later. The state trooper gave me the works, and I just snarled a little. He pointed out that my 1938 driver's license had expired 2 days before. He said he imagined several other troopers would hold me up before I got home, and each give me a summons, all of them for different courts. I drove off with my summons, and I began to dream of a little home in Vermont. It was plain that Connecticut didn't love me, or she wouldn't want to prosecute me in every court from Waterbury to Lakeville for my poor little first offense, into which, as you now know, I was trapped. When I went to bed that night, he was just trying to scare me about those other cops, I said some telling things to him. I said, I have a license to drive this car, which I got by passing a rigorous test. It wasn't really rigorous. You hold that license in your hand. I have simply forgot to renew it. My only fault is that I owe the state of Connecticut $3. Then I went into a bitter arraignment of a state which makes you pay for your car in February, but won't let you pay for the right to drive it till March. I waxed what could easily be called eloquent. I think it was at this moment that I coined the expression fiscal dowdiness. I am rather glad now that I didn't think of it and use it when I was actually talking to the trooper. I might be in the Lakeville jail, or I might have a broken jaw. I am by no means going to let the whole thing drop. I have thought up a nice little scheme for revenge. The day after I was held up, I drove over to Hartford by side roads, disguised as an Ohioan, and got my 1939 driver's license. Attached to it, as always, is an application blank for next year's license. Mail this application on or after March 20th, 1940. I found, in examining the license very carefully, this remarkable message. You must notify this department if you have suffered any physical or mental infirmity during the past year, if it interferes with the operation of a motor vehicle. My plan is a simple but fiendish one. I'm going to write the man in Hartford a note scrawled but legible. Dear Sir, I shall say, since I got my 1939 operator's license, I have gone nuts. I am as crazy as a monkey, and am letting you know like you asked. I am going to lay for you and run you down. There is no use in your trying to escape me. If you notify the police, I will run down your secretary. Every time you see a red light, drop $5,000 out of your car in a shoebox. The money must all be in $3 bills. I am going to sign it, quite simply, 390-2090. I suppose they will catch up with me in the end, but it will be fun. It is fun already. I spend a great deal of time imagining the man in Hartford opening my note, turning pale, grabbing a chair for support, and saying to his secretary, "Good God, girl, 390-2090 has got us." Now maybe I can give some of my energies to the struggle for that larger freedom which engages the attention of all right-minded prisoners of the world. The story of sailing. People who visit you in Bermuda are likely to notice, even before they notice the flowers of the island, the scores of sailing craft which fleck the harbors and the ocean round about. Furthermore, they are likely to ask you about the ships before they ask you about the flowers. And this, at least in my own case, is unfortunate, because although I know practically nothing about flowers, I know 10 times as much about flowers as I know about ships. Or at any rate, I did before I began to study up on the subject. Now I feel that I am pretty well qualified to hold my own in any average discussion of rigging. I began to brush up on the mysteries of sailing a boat after an unfortunate evening when a lady who sat next to me at dinner turned to me and said, "Do you reef in your gaff topsails when you are close-hauled, or do you let go the mizzen-top bowlines and cross-jack braces?" She took me for a sailor and not a landlubber, and of course I hadn't the slightest idea what she was talking about. One reason for this was that none of the principal words except reef, used in the sentence I have quoted, is pronounced the way it is spelled. Gaff topsails is pronounced gazzles. Close-hauled is pronounced cold. Mizzen-top bowlines is pronounced mittens, and cross-jack braces is pronounced crab-apples, or something that sounds a whole lot like that. Thus, what the lady really said to me was, "Do you reef in your gazzles when you are cold, or do you let go the mittens and crab-apples?" Many a visitor who is asked such a question takes the first ship back home, and it is for these embarrassed gentlemen that I am going to explain briefly the history and terminology of sailing. In the first place, there is no doubt but that the rigging of the modern sailing ship has become complicated beyond all necessity. If you want proof of this, you have only to look up the word rigging in the Encyclopedia Britannica. You will find a drawing of a full-rigged modern ship, and under it an explanation of its various spars, masts, sails, etc. There are 45 different major parts, beginning with bowsprit, and going up to davit topping lips. Included in between are, among others, these items: the foretopmast staysail halyards, pronounced fazzles; the topgallant mastyard and lift, pronounced toft, the mizzen topgallant braces, pronounced maces, and the fore topmast backstays and topsail tie, pronounced phrasentozel. The tendency of the average landlubber who studies this diagram for 5 minutes is to turn to Sanskrit in the encyclopedia and study up on that instead. But only a coward would do that. It is possible to get something out of the article on rigging if you keep at it long enough. Let us creep up on the formidable modern sailing ship in our stocking feet, beginning with one of the simplest of all known sailing craft, the Norse herring boat. Now, when the Norse built their sailing boats, they had only one idea in mind: to catch herring. They were pretty busy men, always a trifle chilly, and they had neither the time nor the inclination to sit around on the cold decks of their ships trying to figure out all the different kinds of ropes, spars, and sails that might be hung on their masts. Each ship had, as a matter of fact, only one mast. Near the top of it was a cross piece of wood, and on that was hung one simple square sail, no more complicated than the awning of a cigar store. A rope was attached to each end of the cross piece, and the other ends of these ropes were held by the helmsman. By manipulating the ropes, he could make the ship go ahead, turn right, or turn left. It was practically impossible to make it turn around, to be sure, and that is the reason the Norsemen went straight on and discovered America, thus proving that it isn't really necessary to turn around. As the years went on and the younger generations of Norsemen became, like all younger generations, less hard-working and more restless than their forebears, they began to think less about catching herring and more about monkeying with the sails of their ships. One of these restless young Norsemen one day lengthened the mast of his ship, put up another cross piece about 6 feet above the first one, and hung another but smaller sail on this new cross piece, or spar, pronounced, strange as it may seem, spar. Thus was the main topsail born. After that, innovations in sails followed so fast that the herring boat became a veritable shambles of canvas. A Norseman named Leif the sailmaker added a second mast to his ship just in front of the first one, and thus the foremast came into being, and with it the fore mainsail and the fore topsail. A Turk named Skvar added a third mast and called it the mizzen. Not to be outdone, a Muscovite named Amir put up a third spar on each of his masts. Skvar put up a fourth, Amir replied with a fifth, Skvar came back with a sixth, and so it went, resulting in the topgallant foresail, the top-topgallant mizzen sail, the top-top-topgallant main topsail, and the tip-top-topgallant mainsail, pronounced twee-twee-twee-twa-twa. Practically nobody today sails a full-rigged 7-masted ship, so that it would not be especially helpful to describe in detail all the thousands of different gaffs, sprits, queeps, weems, lugs, miggets, lewards, spelled leewards, gessels, grommets, etc. on such a ship. I shall therefore devote what space I have left to a discussion of how to come back alive from a pleasant sail in the ordinary 20 or 30-foot sailing craft, such as you are likely to be taken for a ride in down in Bermuda. This type of so-called pleasure ship is not only given to riding on its side due to coming about without the helmsman's volition, spelled jibe and pronounced look out, here we go again, but it is made extremely perilous by what is known as the flying jib or boom. The boom is worse than the gaff, for some people can stand the gaff, hence the expression, he can stand the gaff. But nobody can stand the boom when it aims one at him from the floor. With the disappearance of the Norse herring fisherman and the advent of the modern pleasure craft sailor, the boom became longer and heavier and faster. Helmsmen will tell you that they keep swinging the boom across the deck of the ship in order to take advantage of the wind, but after weeks of observation, it is my opinion that they do it to take advantage of the passengers. The only way to avoid the boom and have any safety at all while sailing is to lie flat on your stomach in the bottom of the ship. This is very uncomfortable on account of the hard boards, and because you can't see a thing. But it is the one sure way I know of to go sailing and come back in the boat and not be washed up in the surf. I recommend the posture highly, but not as highly as I recommend the bicycle. My sailing adventures in Bermuda have made me appreciate for the first time the essential wonder of the simple, boomless bicycle. Here lies Miss Groby. Miss Groby taught me English composition 30 years ago. It wasn't what prose said that interested Miss Groby. It was the way prose said it. The shape of a sentence crucified on a blackboard, parsed, she called it, brought a light to her eye. She hunted for topic sentences and transitional sentences the way little girls hunt for white violets in springtime. What she loved most of all were figures of speech. You remember her? You must have had her too. Her influence will never die out of the land. A small schoolgirl asked me the other day if I could give her an example of metonymy. There are several kinds of metonymies, you may recall, but the one that will come to mind most easily, I think, is container for the thing contained. The vision of Miss Groby came clearly before me when the little girl mentioned the old familiar word. I saw her sitting at her desk, taking the rubber band off the roll call cards, rubbing it back upon the fingers of her right hand, and surveying us all separately with quick little hen-like turns of her head. Here lies Miss Groby, not dead, I think, but put away on a shelf with the other T-squares and rulers whose edges had lost their certainty. The fierce light that Miss Groby brought to English literature was the light of identification. Perhaps at the end she could no longer retain the dates of the birth and death of one of the Lake poets. That would have sent her to the principal of the school with her resignation. Or perhaps she could not remember finally exactly how many Cornishmen there were who had sworn that Trelawney should not die, or precisely how many springs were left to Houseman's lad in which to go about the woodlands to see the cherry hung with snow. Verse was one of Miss Groby's delights because there was so much in both its form and content that could be counted. I believe she would have got an enormous thrill out of Wordsworth's famous lines about Lucy if they had been written this way: "A violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when 98 are shining in the sky." It is hard for me to believe that Miss Groby ever saw any famous work of literature from far enough away to know what it meant. She was forever climbing up the margins of books and crawling between their lines, hunting for the little gold of phrase, making marks with a pencil. As Palomides hunted the questing beast, she hunted the figure of speech. She hunted it through the clangorous halls of Shakespeare and through the green forests of Scott. Night after night, for homework, Miss Groby set us to searching in Ivanhoe and Julius Caesar for metaphors, similes, metonymies, apostrophes, personifications, and all the rest. It got so that figures of speech jumped out of the pages at you, obscuring the sense and pattern of the novel or play you were trying to read. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Take that, for instance. There is an unusual but perfect example of container for the thing contained. If you read the funeral oration unwarily, that is to say, for its meaning, you might easily miss the CFTTC. Antony is, of course, not asking for their ears in the sense that he wants them cut off and handed over. He is asking for the function of those ears, for their power to hear, for, in a word, the thing they contain. At first I began to fear that all the characters in Shakespeare and Scott were crazy. They confused cause with effect, the sign for the thing signified, the thing held for the thing holding it. But after a while I began to suspect that it was I myself who was crazy. I would find myself lying awake at night saying over and over, "The thinger for the thing contained." In a great but probably misguided attempt to keep my mind on its hinges, I would stare at the ceiling and try to think of an example of the thing contained for the container. It struck me as odd that Miss Groby had never thought of that inversion. I finally hit on one which I still remember. If a woman were to grab up a bottle of grade A and say to her husband, "Get away from me or I'll hit you with the milk," that would be a thing contained for the container. The next day in class I raised my hand and brought my curious discovery straight out before Miss Groby and my astonished schoolmates. I was eager and serious about it, and it never occurred to me that the other children would laugh. They laughed, loudly and long. When Miss Groby had quieted them, she said to me rather coldly, "That was not really amusing, James. That's the mixed-up kind of thing that happened to me in my teens." In later years, I came across another excellent example of this figure of speech in a joke long since familiar to people who know vaudeville or burlesque, or radio for that matter. It goes something like this. A. What's your head all bandaged up for? B. I got hit with some tomatoes. A. How could that bruise you up so bad? B. These tomatoes were in a can. I wonder what Miss Groby would have thought of that one. I dream of my old English teacher occasionally. It seems that we are always in Sherwood Forest, and that from far away I can hear Robin Hood winding his silver horn. "Drat that man for making such a racket on his cornet," cries Miss Groby. "He scared away a perfectly darling container for the thing contained. A great big beautiful one. It leaped right back into its context when that man blew that cornet. It was the most wonderful container for the thing contained I ever saw here in the Forest of Arden." "This is Sherwood Forest," I say to her. "That doesn't make any difference at all that I can see," she says to me. Then I wake up, tossing and moaning. A sort of genius. On the morning of Saturday, the 16th of September, 1922, a boy named Raymond Schneider and a girl named Pearl Balmer, walking down a lonely lane on the outskirts of New Brunswick, New Jersey, came upon something that made them rush to the nearest house in Easton Avenue, around the corner, shouting. In that house, an excited woman named Grace Edwards listened to them wide-eyed and then telephoned the police. The police came on the run and examined the young people's discovery, the bodies of a man and a woman. They had been shot to death, and the woman's throat was cut. Leaning against one of the man's shoes was his calling card, not as if it had fallen there, but as if it had been placed there. It bore the name Reverend Edward W. Hall. He had been the rector of the Protestant Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. The woman was identified as Mrs. Eleanor R. Mills, wife of the sexton of that church. Raymond Schneider and Pearl Balmer had stumbled upon what was to go down finally in the annals of our crime as perhaps the country's most remarkable mystery. Nobody was ever found guilty of the murders. Before the case was officially closed, 150 persons had had their day in court and on the front pages of the newspapers. The names of two must already have sprung to your mind, Mrs. Jane Gibson, called by the avid press the Pig Woman, and William Carpenter Stevens, once known to 100 million people simply as Willie. The Pig Woman died 11 years ago, but Willie Stevens is alive. He still lives in the house that he lived in 14 years ago with Mr. and Mrs. Hall at 23 Nickel Avenue, New Brunswick. It was from that house that the Reverend Mr. Hall walked at around 7:30 o'clock on the night of Thursday, the 14th of September, 1922, to his peculiar doom. With the activities in that house after Mr. Hall's departure, the state of New Jersey was to be vitally concerned. Number 23 Nickel Avenue was to share with DeRussey's Lane, in which the bodies were found, the morbid interest of a whole nation 4 years later, when the case was finally brought to trial. What actually happened in DeRussey's Lane on the night of September 14th? What actually happened at 23 Nickel Avenue the same night? For the researcher, it is a matter of an involved and voluminous court record, colorful and exciting in places, confused and repetitious in others. Two things, however, stand out as sharply now as they did on the day of their telling. The Pig Woman's story of the people she saw in DeRussey's Lane that night, and Willie Stevens' story of what went on in the house in Nickel Avenue. Willie's story, brought out in cross-examination by a prosecutor whose name you may have forgotten, it was Alexander Simpson, lacked all the gaudy melodrama of the Pig Woman's tale, but in it, and in the way he told it on the stand, was the real drama of the Hall-Mills trial. When the state failed miserably in its confident purpose of breaking Willie Stevens down, the verdict was already written on the wall.